Welcome back, everybody. I'm sure you're all as enthused as I was by that last panel with the two senators under the expert moderation of Jonathan Tepperman from Foreign Affairs. This session also features our third senator, Senator Shaheen. Thank you so much for being here with us. I have very little role at this point, apart from to remind you that this is the last session of this afternoon before we break and then go to the dinner sessions, and also simply to introduce our moderator today, Ms. Jean Meserve, a member of George Washington University Homeland Security Policy Institute and Aspen Institute's Homeland Security Advisory Group. So I'm now going to pass over to Jean.
Video?
With a video. A video before that.
Welcome to our last plenary of the day, or the afternoon rather. They always say to start these things with a joke. I'm not sure how funny you're going to find this, but I'm going to try it. A Greek, an Italian, and a Spaniard walk into a restaurant. Who picks up the tab? Germans. You got it.
Obviously in German.
An effort to smile about a pretty grim situation. We have this economic smash-up going on over in Europe. You've got the Democrats and the Republicans engaged in arm wrestling, trying to determine what they're going to do with the U.S. budget and cutting. But no matter what they decide, it seems inevitable that there are going to be more defense cuts. So our question here today is how to do more with less, or do we inevitably end up eventually doing less with less? We have a very distinguished and large panel with us this afternoon. Let me introduce them, if I may. Starting right here, we have Ljubica Jelocic, Defense Minister of Slovenia. Thank you for joining us. Liam Fox, a Member of Parliament from the UK. Senator Jean Shaheen from the state of New Hampshire. We have General Stefan Abrial, who's the Supreme Allied Commander for the Transformation of NATO, a very large job indeed. And also Swanee Hunt of the Hunt Alternatives Fund. Thank you all for being here. General, I'd like to start with you and use Libya, if we can, as a lens to look at what has to be done in terms of the transformation of NATO. The mission was a success, and yet I have to believe that there were some very hard and difficult lessons that you learned from watching the operation, perhaps some shortcomings that need to be addressed. You tell me that the hot wash is yet to come, but share with us what you can about the hard, difficult lessons that you learned there.
Well, if you authorize me, I would start to start with the good lessons, the positive ones before the hard ones.
Oh, no, we don't want to.
The good side of the story is, as you mentioned, it was a great success. I would like to mention the fact that the treaty itself, the Washington Treaty, was much more flexible than had been thought back in 1949 and was used for this kind of crisis. The fact that decision-making was swift, as General Bouchard mentioned this morning. The fact that we were successful in achieving a very rapid transition from the initial coalition to the alliance, and then including partners to have more regional support. And then during the execution phase, of course, we assessed a few, as we would say, strengths and weaknesses. Strengths, we will capitalize on them. The weaknesses, we are just working on them now. Everybody knows that there were difficulties in the intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance business, that we had shortfalls in the air-to-air refueling, especially for this operation, which was heavy air-oriented. But we had some difficulties also, at least initially, in the way we were organized, and we had to fix it during the operation. These are the types of issues which we are studying now, and we're going to deliver a report on the lessons learned from Libya to the NATO nations in February.
And I'm sure we'll get into some of those at a little bit more depth. But Dr. Fox, I wanted to ask you, as defense minister in Britain, you made some difficult cuts to the defense budget. And I want to ask you that if Britain had to undertake a mission like the mission in NATO 2 years from now, would it be able to do it?
Yes, it would. And while I agree with what the generals just said, I think we need to focus also on the political aspects of what happened. Because one of the biggest problems that we had was not just that we had problems with ISR and we had problems with air-to-air refueling. We had too many absentees. And one of the key elements that we'll have to consider when we're looking at smart defences is great to have better coordination and cooperation, but what if people don't turn up with the assets? And having the capability is not enough. You need to have the political will to do it. And that seems to me the biggest question that NATO is going to have to face up to, because the notable absence of some of the biggest players was quite a shock, not only on the battlefield, but also in the diplomatic field. And I'm afraid that the message has to go out to all the NATO allies that we can't all have the same insurance policy with just some of us paying the premiums.
Minister, on that note, let me turn to you. What did Slovenia contribute to the effort in Libya?
I must say that I'm here representing the country that was not involved in military actions against Libya. And our decision was that as a part of international community, we must help. And we decided to help with humanitarian aid. We sent medical material and also medicines. And we are inviting now injured children from Libya to Slovenia to have rehabilitation there.
Dr. Fox, does that satisfy your concerns? Is that the kind of participation you want to see from a country the size of Slovenia?
Well, there's obviously a different level of participation that can come from countries with different size militaries. But there is a general problem with the fact that only 4 NATO countries, it might be 3 next year, actually making the 2% of GDP spend. We all understand that countries have economic problems, but that is not an excuse to be failing to make their share of GDP spend on defence. And this is a collective defence organisation which seems to be resting on too few shoulders. And I mean, I hate to be blunt about it, but that is the fact. And we're going to have to deal with that as an alliance, or we will not have the sort of collective security in the future that we've taken for granted. And I do entirely accept that some small countries were unable to make military contributions, but there is a general point that many countries in Europe now seem to think that they can contribute the soft power, while the United States, Britain, France in particular will contribute the hard power. And it's all very well to want to be a peacekeeper, but there has to be a peace to keep, and sometimes you have to fight for that.
Senator Shaheen, certainly the U.S. has felt that it has carried more than its burden where NATO is concerned over the years. It played a smaller role in Libya. Is it because of some of the attitudes expressed here by Dr. Fox, or was it strategic, a decision to stand back? And in future, is it probably going to be the pattern that the U.S., because of the changing economic picture, is not going to be necessarily front and center in any military action undertaken by NATO?
No, I think Secretary Panetta said it very clearly yesterday when he talked about our continued commitment to our alliances. We are not going to walk away from our transatlantic alliance, from NATO. But we also, like Liam Fox and like Great Britain, believe that we've got to see our other partners in the alliance step up and commit to their fair share that they agreed to as part of joining the alliance. That's important. It's important to maintain the support that we have in the United States for our NATO partnership, and it's important if we're going to continue to carry out the mission of NATO in the future.
All of these subjects we'll touch back to, but I want to bring you in, Ms. Hunt. I think you have a different point of view on this.
Well, I think that this time of the budget constraints is actually a time of opportunity, budget motivation. I was recently with Anne-Marie Slaughter in a different setting, and she was talking about her experience as the head of policy and planning at the State Department, and this real breakthrough, actually, that the U.S. Secretary of State has made in terms of looking at civil society that's local and saying, no, this isn't just a side issue. These are people on the ground who are not expensive to support, but who can play major roles in preventing war, in stopping war, and in stabilizing after a conflict.
I would like to quickly bring you audience members in if you have some concise questions right over here, right off the bat.
I'm Dan Rundy. I'm with CSIS. Mr. Fox, there were some press reports about some conflict within the British government between development and defense. The UK government is well known for having, quote unquote, ring-fenced its development budget. Could you just speak a little bit about the conflict, or maybe this conflict of development and defense, and what do you think is the proper role of development in managing or helping prevent conflicts?
One of the biggest changes that we had was a change in attitude inside our international development organization, which started to see stabilization, including stabilization in a conflict zone, as a legitimate contribution for them to make. And I think that is reasonable. And I think that was only a recognition that some of that work was already being undertaken through the defense budget, so that it's now undertaken properly through the international development budget is something I was quite pleased to see.
Another question right here.
Thank you. Steve Clemens of the Atlantic Monthly. We've been talking about Libya and it going well and being something that achieved objectives with a lot less cost as something that still raises issues in NATO. But what about Afghanistan, which to some degree has put enormous stress? So you've got perhaps a success case, but you have this enormous ongoing ulcer in NATO, a lot of resentment built in. So I'd love to hear both about the soft power and hard power dimensions of relationship stress inside NATO and among members.
Ms. Hunt?
Thank you for asking. I chair an institute called Inclusive Security, and we've been working actually with NATO, and I'm happy to be in Canada because it was the Canadian PRT that decided that they would have women from the PRT meet with local women who would never have been found by kicking in a door. And they started meeting monthly at the Kandahar airport because it was secure. And it was an illiterate grandmother who took her cell phone and called her contact at the PRT to say, there's something happening at the jail. You should get there. And it was 10 minutes before any other call that announced that there was 600 Taliban who had escaped. And if we were smart, we would have those kinds of contacts all over the country, and they would be thick.
Anybody want to address the military side of this? Dr. Fox?
Well, I think we had sort of three phases in Afghanistan. We'd 01 to 06, where we took our eye off the ball and we didn't understand the resilience or the innovation of the potential insurgents. It led us into a more difficult military situation in 06. We didn't respond to it properly. But when America produced the surge in 09, lo and behold, when you give the military what they need with sufficient numbers, they're able to do the job. That should not come as a surprise. It's not rocket science. But I think that there's a very big element of this debate that requires some real honesty, and that is how quickly you're going to produce the results that we want. And if I can just take it from a British perspective, in Britain we had 150 years between Adam Smith and universal suffrage. We abolished slavery 100 years before we gave women the vote. So maybe it's a little humility that gets us to realize that we're not going to create Jeffersonian democracies overnight in that part of the world in 10 years. It might give us a reasonable sense of perspective and expectation. If we can, by 2014-15, have an improvement in Afghanistan so that they can manage their own security internally and externally without necessary involvement of the outside world, that will be a great step forward. If they can have some democratic institutions, if they can have some free market, these will be major steps forward. But we've got to be very careful that we don't set expectations too high for our domestic audience and too high for those in the region.
But let me comment on the story that Swani told, because I think it speaks volumes to what we need to do. And that is, we have to understand that when we go into a place like Afghanistan, we're not going to be able to win the peace just through our military efforts. And also, as we think about how do we deal with the fiscal challenges that we all face and the need to address security, being able to have work in a local area through development through getting people on the ground engaged is going to be a critical piece of what we need to do.
Minister, you wanted to chime in here.
Yes, I would like to say that even when we speak about military aspects of ISAF, we have at one side hard part of their work and at the other also soft part of their work. Hard is when they are contributing task forces and actually fighting, as you said, for peace. And the soft part is when they are training and mentoring, actually empowering Afghan national security forces to take care of their security on their own, and also empowering civilians to be engaged in their politics. And
is this something Slovenia is doing in Afghanistan?
Of course, and many countries that are there are actually training Afghan security forces to be able to fight for their country on their own, so to say.
We had a question back here in the back.
Yes, from Peter Jennings from Australia, one of the few countries that still continues to increase the size of its defence budget annually. I wonder if panel members would like to express some thoughts about the balance of defence investment between counterinsurgency and counter-terrorism on the one hand versus maintaining high technology, conventional warfighting capabilities. Again, I think this may be an example of a different perspective from the parts of the world where one comes from, but certainly as we look at the Asian area, what we see is the continued dominance of strong and in fact increasing national investment in conventional warfighting capabilities. And I think there's a slight danger perhaps that if we focus too much on counterinsurgency and counter-terrorism, we'll be designing our forces for the last war and rather ignoring the one that we may well face into the future.
General, that sounds like a perfect one for you.
Yeah, I fully agree with what this gentleman is saying. We cannot concentrate on only one aspect of the scope of possible conflicts. We need to be ready to engage across the whole spectrum. And the current engagement in which NATO nations are acting now prove it. We need to make sure that the next crisis, it will not be another Afghanistan, it will not be another Libya. We don't know where and when and how it will be, but we need to be ready to face it if our nations so decide. And therefore, we need to continue transforming our forces and preparing them, adapting them across the spectrum of all possible degrees and intensity of warfare.
But the number of threats is multiplying. We're dealing now with cyber. There is terrorism, the Iranian missile threat, any number of different possible threats coming at the West. In these times of limited economic resources, can you really prepare for all of them? Or do you have to be selective? Do you have to figure out which ones pose the greatest threat and build your capabilities just in those areas?
The objective we are pursuing is to make sure that collectively the alliance is either maintaining the capabilities needed or developing new capabilities for new missions, which will be needed to meet the level of ambition which is decided by our heads of state and government. So it means that we need to address the whole spectrum of possible challenges, threats, and risk, taking into account the level of resources which our governments decide to give
well,
for the
that's the question. Do you have the
and
resources to address them all?
Well, this is why we're engaging in what we call smart defense. And smart defense is not doing more with less, it's doing better with less. Doing better means that we do it more together.
Senator?
Well, I think that's one of the operative concepts here is we're also talking about building regional partnerships, working within our alliances. So in the United States, we're not talking about taking unilateral action. We're talking about how can we build better cooperation that allow us to achieve our goals. The Trans-Pacific Partnership that was just announced, I think, is one good example of that.
But we just heard Dr. Fox tell us that he was disappointed in the NATO response to Libya, that not everybody did step up to the plate who one might have expected to play a part.
Which is why we really have to have multi-layered security arrangements. The current British government has been working with new bilateral relationships with France, for example, as well as obviously a strong relationship with the United States. We've gone back into the Five Powers Defence Arrangement in the Pacific, not in a big way, but to show we've got greater involvement. The same with our involvement in the northern group of countries. And I think that we need to recognize that there's been a major change in the strategic picture. We now live in a very complex, interdependent global economy, where one shock in any one part of that will reverberate very quickly. And we need to be doing a lot of strategic thinking. There needs to be strategic hedging that we do in this. We need to, for example, understand our vulnerability to asymmetry. Our enemies seem to understand that a lot better than we do in terms of their ability to cause us huge amounts of economic and military pain at relatively low cost. And all these things need to change in our thinking because we're trying to run a complex, interdependent global economy with political and military structures that were designed for post-World War II and haven't really adapted to the massive changes in global circumstances.
We have a question back here.
Scotty Greenwood from Washington, D.C. One of the ways it seems to me that you could do less with more, which is not what you want to do, is when from time to time the United States Congress introduces Buy American provisions or things which actually make it more expensive to do procurement in our supply chain. And thankfully, I know, Senator, you fight against those things, but I wonder if you could comment on protectionism and how it makes it more expensive to do procurement deals.
Well, certainly the Buy America provisions that were part of the President's jobs bill have attracted a lot of attention here in Canada, and I think it's reassuring to point out to people that, unfortunately, that legislation didn't go anywhere and that those provisions were consistent with our WTO and all of our other trade agreements. But it is important for us to cooperate, and one of the good examples I think we've got from NATO is several of the countries within NATO cooperating to buy C-17s because that was a need for NATO. The countries on their own wouldn't have been able to afford them, but if they cooperated together, they were able to buy them. And that's an example of how we can do better if we cooperate.
Back here?
Leo Michel, National Defense University from Washington. Dr. Fox, you just mentioned in passing the French-British agreements of last year as one example of a response to the need for smart defense. Can you explain whether or not this initiative has really gotten traction within the various parts of your government below the high level, and also in the defense industry sector, because that, as I understand it, would be an important part of your cooperation?
It is beginning to get traction. It's a lot of people wondered whether it was real or whether it was a political gesture. We found that we had a number of differences in doctrine, for example, between the British and the French military, which we've been ironing out. We've gone into more joint training and exercising. We are looking at procurement. Now, when you're doing procurement in your own government, it's difficult enough. When you have to take account of the different practices in another country, that's an added degree of difficulty, but it made sense for us because Britain and France together constitute more than 50% now of continental European defence spending and 65% of continental European research and development spending in defence. So it was, for us, just as the United States is a natural partner for us to work with because it provides some economy of scale, so does cooperation with France. That's not to say that it's going to be easy, and to be very frank, we've got a few hundred years of mutual suspicion to overcome, which is not going to happen overnight. But it is actually working very well, and I think most of us would say that it's happened in a much more genuinely productive way and constructive way than some of the cynics might have expected.
Dr. Fox, I wanted to go back to something you said earlier about the inequality of spending amongst different members of the alliance, that some are spending at a higher level than others. How in these economic times do you persuade those who are spending less to spend more?
It's, again, if you really want to be a member of a club and you choose to join it, you really should be paying your fees. That's part of the membership. And I think that one of the risks that we have at the moment is in the economic environment that you set out, that we have a risk of bad cuts in the sense of uncoordinated cuts, or people choose to keep the same things and leave us with even bigger gaps than perhaps we saw in Libya. And I think that we do need a single template, some kind of single tool that we use to look at this. When we did our defence changes in the UK, we looked at every change on what was the cost implication, what was the capability implication, what were the operational implications, what were the regeneration implications, and what was the real-world threat that we were being protected from. And in a number of cases, we were spending money on programs for which, when you got to the last box, you couldn't really identify a real-world threat. And there were other areas where there were obviously very big threats that we didn't have the defenses in place that we would need, notably in places like cyber security. So I think that one of the things we need to do in the NATO process is to try to apply a single template to all the countries so that they're looking at their capabilities from a consistent viewpoint, and that we don't end up with a series of haphazard reductions that fit a short-term budgetary reality but leave us with capability gaps further on in the decade.
Let's hear from a smaller member of the alliance.
I think that it is important to see where we actually did the cuts. My government is among
what
those. What
percentage of GDP do you spend on military?
We spent in a year 2008 1.67.
Percentage-wise, do you know what that is?
Of GDP. And now, at the end of 2011, we will spend 1.32. So it is quite a lot in 3 years. But what I would like to stress is that it is important where these cuts are done. Because we have 3 different areas of defense spending. One is personnel costs. The second one is operational costs. The third one is investments. And as a gentleman before posed the question of investments into what, actually? Do we have any priorities? To what kind of things we have these investments? As far as for example, my country is concerned, we decided to do more with less in a way to, first, to look through personnel costs and find out what people can we dismiss. Second, we decided not to shrink operational costs because we know that we must train our people. We must send them to operations because they must get experiences in order to be better in future, to be prepared. As far as investments are concerned, the problem is that we had to stop our investments into technology, into higher technology projects, which is very bad for future. But for the moment, we still have arsenals of weapons. Also in Europe, we all have full stocks. And the problem is what we are going to do in next years, while not having enough new technologies, not as General Abrial would like to plea for, not to have enough high technology and smart defense projects for future.
Anybody want to chime in and comment on this situation and how it can best be addressed?
Well, I think everybody remembers that once upon a time, Ronald Reagan said that defense is not a budget issue, and you have to spend what you need to spend. These times are over. Until Dr. Fox will be successful in convincing the nations to spend more, I have to deal with the fact that they spend less. And not only they spend less, but they don't do it in a coordinated fashion. Because no single nation is asking anybody or informing any other nation before coming to an domestic decision on a reform. And then we are left with a situation where we have to re-establish a posteriori this global coherence, making sure that the alliance globally still has the capability to address the engagement which are decided by our political masters.
We have another question right there.
General, I'm wondering if you could answer one question. In 2009, the Lisbon Treaty called for a renaming of the ESDP to a common security and defense policy. Could you tell me what that's for, 2011, and to some extent how that relates to what you just said, Mr. Fox, concerning the fact that France and Britain are 65%? Why do you need that?
Well, I'm not working for the EU, I'm working for NATO. But in so doing, one of the very strong aspects of my work is to coordinate with the EU on the defense aspect. And you probably all know that in the EU there is what they call the Pooling and Sharing Initiative, which emerged from the Ghent summit last year. In NATO, we have this Smart Defense Initiative. What we try to do, since, as you know, 21 nations belong to both organizations, is to make sure that we do not duplicate our work and that we go even one step beyond that, and that the work performed in NATO, the work performed in the EU are complementary. And that both these aspects of work contribute to support the nations in developing better capabilities for future engagements.
Over here.
Thank you. I'm Anne Penketh from BASIC, the British American Security Information Council. We were talking about the capabilities earlier, but nobody's mentioned the nuclear aspect, where there obviously it's no longer taboo in America to discuss this. Now, it is being discussed usually behind closed doors within NATO, currently in the Deterrence and Defense Posture Review, and also in America at the moment within the Pentagon, which is conducting a review. So I'm wondering what Dr. Fox, I think I know what you think. We have launched in Britain the Trident Commission, and Senator Shaheen, where you think there could be further reductions or even reconfiguration of the nuclear weapons complex. Just finally, I would say that I've been quite struck by how, as soon as a military man takes off his uniform, he starts saying things which were completely different from when he was in office. General Cartwright, who was the vice chairman of the Chiefs of Staff, is now a member of Global Zero for total nuclear disarmament.
Let's get an answer here.
Well, let me just say how pleased I am that we passed the New START Treaty. It's something that I worked very hard on, and it had bipartisan support in the Senate. That's how it got done. And part of that, of course, is to reduce the nuclear weapons that we have in the United States and Russia. But part of that agreement was to agree to modernize our nuclear arsenal. And I do think that we will do that in some respects. It may be affected as we look at the fiscal constraints that we're under, but we are going to modernize the arsenal as part of that agreement.
And we have
I think it's just fair to say that we've had this argument for a long time, particularly in the United Kingdom, that we believe in a minimum credible nuclear deterrent. I mean, it's of a different scale from the United States and Russia, for example. But our view is that as long as the threat of nuclear blackmail may exist in the years for which we're now planning, right out to 2050, we have to maintain that expenditure. I do find it interesting, and I'll use that term, in the United Kingdom, that people think it's outrageous that we would spend £20 billion for the capital cost of the upgrade to the Trident programme, but they think nothing of spend, which gives us 35 years of protection from nuclear blackmail, but they think nothing of spending $12 billion on the Olympics for 3 weeks. So I just raise that because I think it gives us all a sense of perspective.
Go ahead.
But I would like to pick up on a different point that you made, which I find striking, where you're talking about when the roles change, that the viewpoints change. When I was U.S. ambassador, in a very tough time in Austria, I had the privilege of hosting the negotiations that created the federation in part of Bosnia, and that was the precursor to NATO. And I had been calling for military intervention at that point for 2 years, and leaning and leaning and leaning on President Clinton for intervention. It wasn't until afterwards that, looking around at the White House when we were signing the agreement, and I saw this sea, no offense, guys, but this sea of gray suits, and I thought, how did I miss that? How did I realize that even though Yugoslavia had the highest percentage of women PhDs of any country in Europe, that there were no women involved in those negotiations. And that's when I realized that what we're talking here about this lethal economic environment, it actually could be an iconoclastic economic environment. And we've got to have the courage to step back and say, when we are involved in a military intervention like I was, leaning forward into that, what a failure to say that the least violent thing we can do in this moment, which I believed and believe, was military intervention. What a failure we are at that point. So what could we have done differently? Not just a month before, but a decade before to have prevented that. And that's where you've got to have the full involvement of the whole society, and particularly, you all, particularly, getting the women's voices up. They are so highly invested in not having that conflict, and they are so good at building bridges and bringing a different perspective in. And they are so much better in the post-conflict time in terms of corruption, excuse me. And I'm not talking about one particular guy and one particular woman, but we need to take our blinders off. This is not a marginal issue. This is hardcore.
I want to pick up a little bit on the prevention piece, because I think one of the things that somebody mentioned earlier was an important shift in the United States as we're looking at where to put resources and trying to rebalance the resources into diplomacy and state more than they have been over the last decade or so, recognizing that we still have commitments to security and to defense, but if we look at what can we do in prevention, what can we do to avoid the conflict before it happens, that beefing up diplomacy, beefing up those development efforts are a really important piece of that.
Over here, we had a question.
Thanks very much.
And it's cheaper.
Thank you. Paul Cornish from the UK. It's a question for Dr. Fox, and I'm afraid I'd just like to return for a moment to this issue about the need to balance the budgetary imperative, if you like, with the security imperative. We've talked a lot about it just now, and indeed touched upon it quite a lot yesterday in the forum. Clearly, I think we'd all agree that if you can't find this point of balance between the budgetary and the security, then you end up not just with no money, but with no security either, which is probably a bad thing. The European Union faces difficulties. We all know that. But there are some in the Eurozone that face not just difficulties, but oblivion. This might not just be fiscal austerity, it could be fiscal collapse or wipeout. So I wonder whether the target of 2% or even 1.5% of GDP on defence could actually add yet more political stress over the next, I don't know, 5 to 10 years, that really we could probably do without. And if it is therefore politically unlikely that we might achieve that, then what do we do? Is there scope for more role sharing? Could we, for example, imagine, I don't know, that the French will have the aircraft carriers, the Germans will have the tanks, and we'll have the bandsmen or whatever? Is there going to be some scope perhaps for joint procurement? I'm struck as well that some of those who have responded to the Eurozone crisis have said that this makes the case for closer political union in the European Union in order to get us out of the Eurozone problem. It's not a view that I take, I have to say. So my question is, do you think, Dr. Fox, that this is the moment for even closer political union in the EU as far as defence is concerned?
I think you know the answer to that question. No, it's not. I mean, the problems of the countries in the Eurozone come largely from the fact that it's an economic problem. They allowed themselves to build a currency on sand. They allowed countries to be in the single currency who had not met the convergence criteria and aggravated it by not applying proper fiscal policies in the period after the creation of the single currency. So a lot of this was in many ways inevitable. Of course, we want to have better cooperation. But the point I made earlier, we have to be sure that people will turn up to the party on the day. And it's all very well to say we will depend on X country and Y country for a certain capability, but if the political will is not there as well as the military capability itself, then it's a dangerous thing to rely on. And ultimately, for all countries, we have to fall back as best we can afford on what we absolutely require for the protection of our own people. The defence of our people, the safety of our country is the first responsibility of government. And I say that as one of those who believes very much that debt is a strategic issue and that we're in a period of some long correction now. Having had a very good party living beyond our means, we're going to have one big hangover for some time to come. And you cannot be secure if you're broke. And in the UK, we're paying more in debt interest this year than we're spending on the military and our foreign service and our overseas budget all combined. And even if we eliminate our national deficit by 2015, which of course is unprecedented, that will have risen to an even higher number. That's what it is to live beyond your means, and that's what it is to abandon the concepts of sound money.
General, this questioner raised a couple of questions that I'd like to bounce off you, too. The idea of joint procurement, the idea that perhaps different countries develop different capabilities so they mesh with one another for a unified defense approach. Your reaction to those ideas?
These are all aspects of the work we are conducting now in NATO under the title Smart Defense. We have basically three strands, three pillars. One is prioritization. What should we do first? What is most important in our eyes to face the challenges of today and tomorrow? 2, specialization. How much can we build on the specific strength of this or that nation? With the difficulty that specialization will be a sovereign decision by each nation. You cannot impose specialization on any nation. So you need her agreement. And cooperation. Cooperation is doing more things together, finding grouping of nations with enough strategic proximity to have full confidence in each other, but they can develop something together. And also, which is very important, as Dr. Fox mentioned, that this capability will be available to the alliance as a whole once all members of the alliance will have made the decision to engage somewhere. This notion of availability is a difficult one because it's part of a balance which has to be struck by each nation between solidarity and sovereignty, but this difficult question has to be addressed up front.
How do we address it?
How do we
address it? You say it has to be addressed.
It is a sovereign decision by each nation. We can only facilitate the debate, but it's a sovereign debate inside each nation.
Question here.
My name is John Glenn. I'm with the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition, and I'm really glad to be here. When I hear about doing less with more, or more with less, I'm reminded of Secretary Gates, former Secretary Gates, saying, development's a lot cheaper than sending soldiers. And yet, of course, in the United States, our foreign assistance is less than 1% of the budget, and we have a debate where we're talking about questioning its usefulness. What's nice today is to hear about the sort of NATO building on the comprehensive approach. But that means, of course, having a smart defense, but how you work with your civilian partners, how you work with the development and the diplomacy side of things. Consider, let me just put out the Horn of Africa. We've got a piracy issue off the coast that is dealt with through a mission that's largely military, and we've got a humanitarian disaster, a famine and a war that we're dealing with in those circumstances. How are we doing on this? What lessons have we learned about we know we can't do it with the military alone?
Who wants to grab it?
Well, the comprehensive approach is part of the decisions which have been made in Lisbon last year at the NATO summit, part of a declaration, part of a strategic concept. NATO is fully aware that there is a need to better work civil and military side by side together when we are engaged, because we are all only one of many actors in the field. And therefore, we need to make sure that we prepare to engage together much in advance, which means we need to know each other better. We need to train, or to at least have a good vision of how we train, how we will act in theater. We can share things like lessons learned, best practices, but we need to talk to each other. We need to better know each other, which is not easy, because not every civilian organization is ready to engage alongside the military or to be seen as associated with the military. Inside NATO, what has been decided is to develop a small, limited, but effective capability for this comprehensive approach, which means we are developing small civil-military interfaces throughout the command structure. We are not developing a core of experts. It will be much spending for nothing, because there are so many experts out there who could be used. It could be very happy to be engaged. But at least we need an interface to be able to identify with whom we could work and how best to prepare. And this is ongoing.
So your model here is whether or not it's between two, like military and development aid, et cetera. And so I'm offering a third in terms of how we do more with less. It's do it differently with less. And that is that you find the resources, the untapped resources who are there in the country. That you mentioned Horn of Africa, you could have said Darfur, you could have said Liberia. The Nobel Peace Prize will be given to 2 women from Liberia who approach it differently, one from the grassroots, one from the top, from the presidency. Lema Gaboy from the grassroots got the Christian and the Muslim women together, thousands of them sitting out, dressed all in white, in the sun, in the rain, until they got Charles Taylor into the peace talks. They went to Accra, they surrounded the building where the warlords were meeting, and when the warlords tried to leave through the door, they slammed themselves against the door, and the negotiator who had tried to get them to leave, to be arrested, started calling out to them, "The men are trying to get out the window!" And the women went and pushed them back in. Darfur, Canadian Mobina Jaffer, fabulous third round of the talks. And the men are arguing and arguing about where the lines are going to be that they want. And because of the river, they all want the river. They're arguing about the river. She gets women into the talks. The woman says, that river dried up 6 years ago, right? It matters who you have from the local players.
Senator?
Well, I think both Swanee and the General have spoken eloquently to the need to cooperate to deal with these kinds of situations. But I want to go back to something Dr. Fox said earlier about the first role of all of our nations is to protect our own security, which is very true. But the kinds of situations you point out points to the pitfalls of isolationism, and it's something that Senators McCain and Udall talked about in the previous panel. And we're seeing a rise of nationalism and isolationism in parts of the world because, in large part, some of our economic challenges. And that is a very dangerous road to continue to go down. So I do think it's important to point out that even though we all need to protect our own security, it shouldn't be at the expense of allowing the kind of global challenges that present themselves from the example that you give in Africa.
It's also impossible to be isolationist
right.
in the global environment in which we now exist economically. As we saw, everything from the banking crisis to the Japanese tsunami taught us that we are now more interrelated than ever before, and what we need to find are new levers, new ways to deal with that interconnectivity. And it is quite frightening from a European perspective to hear some of the voices from Capitol Hill with resonances of some of the most frightening isolationism that we sort of heard pre-World War II. And history teaches us what that sort of isolationism can lead to.
I would like to make a short remark on comprehensiveness. Whenever we speak about all efforts that we have at disposal to give them to the people whom we would like to support, the question is, do we listen to the local people? What do they need and what kind of support they need? And this is something that Swanee touched upon. What I would like to say is that even when we are giving development aid, it is important to accompany it with people, with experts that are able to deliver it in a proper way. And this is important within NATO to understand, to have not only military people, but also civilian experts accompanied and being ready to cooperate with ministries of foreign affairs or ministers that are responsible for development aid, and to have a common effort to give that money or other kinds of supplies in a proper way, not to send it to different countries, for example. It happens, even in our small countries, it happens that we are sending military people to one country and development aid to other countries. So it is important somehow to put them together and send them together to places where we would like to make life better.
David Kramer from Freedom House in the U.S. Talking about the need to provide for security and defense leads me to the question about missile defense. Given the phased adapted approach that President Obama announced, given that this is supposed to be done together with NATO, but also given the very strong Russian opposition to it, and also the financial constraints countries in Europe face as well as the United States, how do you see the future of missile defense unfolding?
And I should say that there's a headline today saying U.S. budget woes could threaten plans for NATO missile defense system in Europe, a story from the AP, despite Secretary Panetta's comments yesterday.
Missile defense is a mission which has been decided in Lisbon in November 2010 by the heads of state and government. So we address it now. The construct is that NATO is developing a command and control architecture at 28 in which national contributions will plug in. And of course, at the beginning, the US contribution will be the most important one, if not the only one. And then other nations may add on what they were ready to contribute. the cost of missile defense to NATO is not that high, because NATO had been engaging already for years in what we called ALTBMD, theater missile defense. So the additional cost to switch from theater missile defense to territorial collective defense is 200 million euros, which is bearable even in an austere environment like today. So following the decision by the heads of state and government in Lisbon last year, we hope that the contributions by all nations will be there on time.
Senator Shaheen, could you weigh in on the super committee and what you think is going to happen there?
Well, first of all, I would be surprised if missile defense does not get included as part of the budget, because I think there is support for that, bipartisan support for that. I think it's not clear what's going to happen with the super committee. Hopefully, we will see an agreement. I think it's a very important signal, not only for the United States, but for the international community and global markets. But it's not at all clear. I have been part of a bipartisan group in the Senate that has been mirrored in the House. We now have about 45 senators, equally divided between Republicans and Democrats, who have signed on to the President's Deficit Reduction Commission, the Simpson-Bowles Commission, that said we need $4 trillion in savings and we need to put everything on the table: mandatory programs, domestic defense spending, and revenue. And hopefully that will send a very powerful message to the super committee that they will come to some kind of an agreement.
We'll see on Wednesday. Go ahead.
Camille Grand, one quick comment on this particular issue of spending less. It's very much a European and Western debate. I mean, the rest of the world is spending more and more and more. In the last 10 years, the Chinese defense budget, according to the lowest estimate, rise by about 200%. The same is true about the Russian defense budget. The same is true about most of Asian defense budget, and in the Middle East and elsewhere. So I think we have to think about that. We don't actually live in a world of sort of Teletubbies that are not interested in hard security. So we have to deal with that issue. Some of them might be wrong, but that's what they're doing. The second point is that it leads to the resource issue, and I wanted to push a little further the debate on whether mutualization, cooperation was feasible in the age of defense austerity. The problem I think we might face rather sooner than later is the fact that 0 + 0 = 0. So you might add nothing to nothing, and you don't get much. So I think it's a major problem that we have to think through when thinking about smart defense. And I think you can't. And the doing more with less is not. It's very much a bumper sticker and not so much a concept. And finally, one last question: it's the issue of the political will to do that. Because when you mutualize, when you put together assets, when you develop them together, when you do a joint system, if there are either caveats or the lack of desire to go into an operation, then those capabilities become even more useless. You've spent the money, but it's not available. So how do we deal with these issues? Thank you.
General?
Well, I agree with the fact that we need to make sure that we set the foundations for a successful smart defense. Which means, first, I hate the words do more with less. We cannot do more with less anymore. We could have done this maybe 20 years ago when the budgets were larger. But now, the budget at a stage where we can only do better with less, but no more. Second, we are lucky enough that we are not yet at 0. So it's a little bit more than 0, and a little bit more than 0 makes hopefully much more than 0. And the third point is, I couldn't agree more. We need to address this issue of availability. There must be an engagement from the beginning, and a declaration, a statement, whatever form it takes, that when nations develop a capability together, it will be available both to any one of the nations contributing for her individual sovereign needs if they occur, and it must also be available at 28 once the 28 nations have made the decision to engage in an operation. There should be no choice anymore.
You're on the same page?
Yes, if I could just go back to the point that the senator made, which I completely agree with, which is about the resource issue. and the message it sends to markets and allies as well as the domestic audience. There are a lot of countries, especially in Asia Pacific, who are wondering whether America is a basket in which they want to place all their eggs at the moment. And they're looking to see whether the United States and the politicians in the United States are actually willing to take the very tough decisions to put America on a stable, longer-term course, because the alternative is managed decline. And we're seeing already, if you were in Asia Pacific and you looked at NATO and you looked at what the current trajectory of our economies would mean in the longer term for spending, this is a pivotal moment for us all. This is about whether we take the major historic choices to do the very unpleasant things that we'll be required to do in the short term in order to give us long-term hope, stability and security. I think it's you know, the gauntlet's been thrown down to this generation, and the question is whether we've got the moral courage to take it up.
I would like to comment on your question, which was, I think, very important, especially while speaking about political will for cooperation in the defense field. I must say that we have in Europe some cases when military people were able to cooperate, but politicians not so much. And there were cases in which even units were established, military units, that helped then to somehow warm up political dialogue between countries. And when there is a question of smart defense as far as the cooperation is concerned, I think that there are many cases within Europe when historically some countries, some states, were ready to cooperate better than with other states. And this is somehow that must be empowered now, this regional cooperation that we already have had in past in Europe. When there was a time of PFP, many countries from Eastern Europe and to Southeast Europe were involved into common projects together with NATO member states. And from that cooperation, we knew that some projects were able to survive. And this means that also for future, within Smart Defense Initiative, we will be able to make some projects successful within these regions of like-minded countries, countries that historically cooperated, and so on. So I believe in this concept. I think that we will be successful in this way.
I may have missed this because I was playing traffic cop with the mics. Did any of you address the question about how much others are spending on defense? How you see increased defense budgets elsewhere in the world and the impact?
Well, you're correct. Actually, my numbers are that China's defense budget has tripled. And we've talked about Europe since the end of the Cold War. Europe's GDP has increased 55%, but their defense spending has gone down 20%. So it's clearly an issue. It's an issue for us in America. As we've talked about, we are going to make some cuts in our defense budget. But I would take a little issue with what you've said about not being able to cut anymore. I think we do reach a point where we made so many cuts that you get into the muscle and then down to the bone. But I'm not sure we're there yet. And I think we've got a number of cases in point where we can be more cost-effective in how we're spending, and particularly with some of our weapons programs, we can be more efficient. We have oversight committees in the Senate that have looked at our costs for contracting that in many cases are out of control, and that's part of the defense budget. So I think we need to be much more accountable in how we are spending defense dollars, in addition to all of the other things that have been said here.
General?
Yeah, I think that Camille is right, not only because he's French, but his comment about the rest of the world is exactly on the spot. We will continue suffering from the impact of the budget pressure all our nations are going through. But other parts of the world are actually rearming. Budgets are increasing across the world, except in the Euro-Atlantic area. Some parts of it for good, like our good Australian friends, some others maybe not. So we must not lose sight of the fact that NATO must continue to develop the minimum level of capabilities needed to continue to provide defense and security. And we cannot do it with zero.
Back here we have a question.
Hi, Chris Taylor from Washington, D.C. I wonder, as we're discussing how we reimagine smart security and how we're going to pay for it, and Senator Shaheen sort of preempted my comment a little bit by talking contracting dollars versus accountability. I wonder if you might comment, anyone on the panel, under an acceptable accountability program, is there not a greater role for the private sector in international security? Particularly, perhaps not in the member states themselves, but in international organizations like NATO, like the UN, when we talk about dealing with peace enforcement missions, peacekeeping missions. And indeed, I'll be as provocative as I can to say even the Somali pirate issue. Under an acceptable accountability program, is there not a greater role for the private sector when we're talking about assets and bang for buck?
Who wants to tackle that one?
We had a particular problem in the UK when the new British government came to office, and we realised that there was no internal mechanism for looking at the costs of our biggest programmes. So they were running way ahead of budget, they were running way behind time at an accelerating rate. We brought in a new programme, and we've actually made big strides at getting some cost control back into the system. And we don't have the problems that the US has in terms of adding constantly to the programs for local political reasons, and that adds a substantial extra cost, I think, in the programs. And I think that there needs to be a clear understanding by politicians what their role is, and that's to provide our military with what they need when they need it. We are not primarily a job creation program. And because there is that very big interface between the defense industry as an employer and a provider of wealth and the needs of the military, until they're separated out a little bit, it's very difficult for policy makers not to wittingly or unwittingly add further cost.
You know, I think since I raised the issue, I feel a need to respond to it. I think there is, in some instances, obviously a role for private contractors, but what we saw in, particularly when we went into Iraq, was that there were a number of private contractors hired and there wasn't sufficient oversight of that. So we also have to be very careful in that respect as well.
Over here?
Thank you. Peter Lichtenbaum from Washington, D.C. I first want to thank Mr. Fox for his efforts on behalf of the US-UK relationship, and particularly the efforts to bring into force the Defense Trade Cooperation Treaty, which hopefully will further strengthen the alliance over a period of decades, if not centuries.
Cut our costs.
And cut our costs. My question actually relates to cyber and the disturbing reports which we've seen over a period of years relating to intrusive attacks by foreign governments to the U.S. Government systems, to private sector systems, defense contractors. We've seen numerous reports of breaches. There was a recent report that the Senate, several senators are going to ask for an investigation of certain Chinese companies who are here in the United States. My question is, what is your level of concern about this problem? It seems to me that it's a major challenge to our national, getting value for our national security dollars if foreign powers are able to access the programs that we're developing. And if you're not satisfied, what are the specific steps that you think the various governments who are targeted ought to be taken? Thank you.
General?
Cyber is a concern for NATO, and cyber defense is a mission for NATO. It's one of the two missions, the new missions which have been decided in Lisbon last year: missile defense, cyber defense. The broadest aspects of cyber defense are dealt with inside the nations. The NATO mission is to deal with cyber defense of NATO's own systems, not to look at industry or energy or homeland security. It's not NATO's mission. So the mission which has been decided again by the 28 heads of state and government is to look at how to best defend the NATO-owned systems, which is just one very small part of the spectrum.
Is NATO only looking at it defensively? NATO
Absolutely.
must be looking at it offensively as well.
It's very clearly stated in the strategic concept, it's strategic defense only. Cyber defense only.
Should it be offense?
It shouldn't. Our heads of state and government have decided it's defense, so it's defense.
It's very difficult in the real world to differentiate between cyber defense and offense. And I think that one of the problems that we face in all this debate is that we're going into the entire cyber program and the whole cyber debate with a lack of doctrine. We went into the nuclear age with a much clearer idea of what our doctrine was, and we lack that. And as in many things, almost our physical ability to do things has outstripped our philosophical intellectual framework within which we're operating. And maybe we need to think about doing a lot more thinking rather than just spending.
And the lack of boundaries making it much more complicated than many other issues. I think we have a question right there.
May I say?
Oh, certainly. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. When we are speaking about defense spending and cybersecurity, usually on a national level, we would never find money for cybersecurity within the defense budget, but it is in other budgets, which shows actually that within our budgets, we have spends that are no more part of defense budget, but in other parts of our budgets, but they still cover our security needs. And sometimes, probably, we should in future think about all these different views or perspectives of security that are covered within our budgets. And when we will put them all together, we would see how much actually we invest in our security. Because in defense budget, it's not everything. Go ahead.
Dov Zakheim, CSIS and CNA. Senator, I was pleased you mentioned wartime contracting, since I was on the Wartime Contracting Commission, and we found $60 billion in waste. And I want to ask you a couple of questions about efficiency. First, we recommended quite a bit of legislation. Could you tell me where you stand on that and what you think the prospects are? Otherwise, there won't be much oversight, and we'll waste more money in the future. Secondly, one of the biggest sources of inefficiency is the growth in our defense health program, which pretty soon will equal the defense budgets of most of Europe. There has hardly been an increase in anything to do with that program in terms of co-pays or anything else because Congress doesn't want to. Could you talk a little bit about what Congress will do there? And finally, it's all very nice to talk about a division of labor between state and defense, and my friend Anne-Marie Slaughter worked very hard to make something like that happen, as did Secretaries Clinton and Gates. But Congress gives all the authorities to state, but no money, and all the money to defense, but no authorities. Could you talk about that, please?
That's an easy one, huh?
Well, first of all, I think your commission, your contracting commission, reported before I got to the Senate, so I don't know what your recommendations are. I don't know what your recommendations are, so why don't you tell me and I can tell you if I support them. I assume I would support most of them, since Claire McCaskill is always reporting on the need for us to address oversight. With respect to health care, actually in the NDAA authorization, so our defense authorization, there is an increase in co-pays for TRICARE. And it speaks to the challenge that we have in the United States in particular, and I think the rest of the world does to some extent, but we certainly do in the US, and that is how we are going to address the rising cost of health care. And I think that needs to be done through delivery system reforms, which is how are we going to improve the way we deliver health care so that we do it more efficiently and improve the quality. I think there are a number of provisions in our health care law that help address that. We're not going to see the results of those for several years to come. But I do think that's very important, and I actually support increasing funding for state. And unfortunately, we have not been successful at that. As you're probably aware, we have not even been able to get the Foreign Operations Appropriations Bill, which includes funding for state, to the floor of the Senate because there are so many riders that address things that are irrelevant to funding our diplomatic efforts, like the global gag rule, which I oppose.
We're running a little low on time, but we have a question back here in the corner.
Thank you. Paul Eaton, National Security Network and retired soldier, perhaps on the Cartwright model. We haven't talked about one game changer, and that's the biologicals. About 25 years ago, we had the Shinrikyo event, which could be qualified as competent chemists, incompetent biologists, incompetent dispersal system, and incompetent leadership. You can't count on 3 incompetents now. Biological engineering has surpassed a whole lot of expectations. They've gotten better, faster, cheaper. The United States has reduced its defense mechanisms in DHS by about 60%. So spending is going down while we maintain our efforts to conduct industrial age warfare, however improved it might be. So how's NATO doing?
Biodefense? Anything to tell? He was asking about biodefense. What can you tell us about NATO and biodefense?
Well, NATO is working also on the whole spectrum of chemical, biological, radiological defense with the help of the nations, of course. And NATO cannot invent anything if the nations do not provide what is needed for this defense. But this CBRN, chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear defense issue, is one of the topics we're dealing with in the framework of smart defense. And we are basically looking at the nations who are ready to engage in projects and who are ready to make them, again, to the same point, available to the alliance as a whole. We have good indication that we are going to make progress, that there will be projects in this domain which can be implemented very soon.
We are running really low on time, but I would like each of you to weigh in on this subject. The two themes here that have really been stressed are money and disproportionate investment in the alliance, and also commitment and disproportionate commitment. In the face of those things, is NATO in jeopardy or is it not? Could each of you give me your thoughts on that? Why don't we start at this end, if you don't mind, Minister?
Well, I think that there is no threat for NATO's future. We still have countries that would like to become members of NATO, which shows that this is alliance of future, so to say.
But do they want to come into NATO without doing what would be characterized by some members as their fair share?
Well, it's interesting that usually countries that would like to become members are investing much more than those that are members already, because they would like to show their willingness to become members. And I must say that candidates are sometimes countries that are really trustful in their efforts. If we would think about our investments into national budgets in a smart way, and if we would be able to cooperate together with trust on a regional or multinational level, I think we will be successful as not only as NATO members, but also as members of international community. And the last point which I would like to make is we still have to think about all those instruments that are available in the toolbox that was mentioned today while we were talking about the situation in the Arab world. I'm afraid military instruments are not the only ones that are the most important thing to bind us, members of NATO, but we still have other things to do together.
Dr. Fox, the future?
I think that we need to remember that NATO is a political organization as well as a military alliance, and I think that in order to maintain our credibility militarily, we've pretended there's more political cohesion than there has been. That needs to be addressed by the politicians, as well as the military dealing with the other side. It will continue to work as long as the United States continues to have a commitment to defense beyond the borders of the United States, which is why the isolationism is so important. But the European countries must carry more of the burden and not try duplication, which is why the European Union CSDP is potentially so dangerous. It's a diversion and a dilution of scarce resources at a time that we don't need it. We need better threat analysis, better strategic overview. We need to be looking at CBRN and the sort of asymmetric threats we might face. But someone said that the hardest thing in defense, the only thing that's harder than getting a new idea in, is getting an old idea out. And it means that we have to do some disinvesting as well as investing. If we have finite budgets, we're going to have to disinvest in the things that are no longer required, however much emotional attachment the military or the public may have to them. We've been through some of that pain in the UK, but we will not find the room to invest in the things that our public require unless we're also willing to disinvest in some of the things that they felt comfortable with for a long time.
Senator?
Well, I think the future of NATO is strong, but like any other alliance of this nature, it has to adapt to changing times, and we're going through that kind of difficult change right now, but I think the strategic concept addresses some of those changes we need to make. And I do think that we're going to see more of a public debate, both in Europe and in the United States, around what we hope our defense will include, and that means NATO as well.
General?
Well, I think that the success of the operation to protect the people of Libya proves that NATO is not in jeopardy. It's a success. I think it proved also that currently there is no other similar instrument available to the nations to fulfill their goals. And the initial reactions I get across the nations of NATO on our smart defense initiative is very positive. I feel some appetite. I'm confident that the current dynamic can be translated into decisions in Chicago, into implementing concrete projects, therefore giving us the momentum to develop a long-term vision on the way we address capability development, even in this austere budgetary environment.
Swani?
I'm very struck by what the minister said, and you as well. I think that as we disinvest, de-invest or disinvest? Disinvest. As we disinvest, we have to reinvent. And the UN Security Council is helping us with Security Council Resolution 1325, which has spawned national action plans for each one of those NATO member states and there's a whole critical mass of those coming together now to look at how women can be brought fully forced into the peace building beginning to end. And so NATO has a chance.
Great. We have to leave it there. Thank you all so much, Swani Hunt, General Abrial, Senator Shaheen, Liam Fox, and also Ljubica Jeličić. Am I getting close? Yes. Close enough. Okay. Thank you all. Appreciate it. Thank you all.
Thank